Hello and welcome everybody to our monthly install of South Pole's webinar series. Today we are going to talk about the SEC's new climate-related disclosures and the final rule. A few pieces of housekeeping as we get started. The webinar will be recorded and we will send it out to everyone afterwards, so don't feel like you need to take notes. Also, everyone's muted as they join, so it's just part of the functionality. And if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat, and we will hold lots of time for questions at the end. Next slide. Bear with me as I go through our disclosures. South Pole is not an accredited auditor or external reviewer. The information provided in this webinar does not and is not intended to constitute as being limited or reasonable assurance. Similarly, the information provided in the final deliverables does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. This is for general information purposes only. You should contact your attorney to obtain advice with respect to any of the information provided herein. Only your attorney can provide assurances that the information contained herein or the interpretation of it is applicable or appropriate for your particular situation. And specifically for the information today, as many of you know, the SEC's final rule is going through some litigation currently, and the final rule requirements, the implementation timelines, and much of what discussed is still up in the air. So things can change. Now, with that out of the way, I want to hear from you all just to get started so we can level set and try to tailor this webinar a little bit more to who's on the call today. We'll put up a poll. How prepared is your company feeling right now for the SEC's final rules? I'll give you about 30 seconds to read, but starting from you're feeling fully prepared to disclose to you're just starting to evaluate, I imagine most of you will be somewhere in the middle being on the call today. Great, and I can see from the results here, it is most of the people here are still understanding the rule requirements, so we will do our best to help you with that. Now, as we pull the presentation back up, for those who haven't heard of us, quick introduction to South Pole. We are a global sustainability advisory firm headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland globally, but locally in North America in New York City. We provide a variety of environmental and sustainability advisory services from greenhouse gas accounting, climate targets and roadmaps, particularly important for today, climate risk assessments, but also renewable energy pathways, biodiversity assessments, and we help decarbonize agricultural supply chains as well. To introduce you to who we are, my name is Chris Heisel. I'm the Director of Climate Strategies for North America at South Pole, and with me is Sundara Bandaram, who's a managing consultant on our environmental impact accounting team, and Harman Gill, who leads our risk and opportunities team here for North America. So what we will cover today is really what the SEC rule entails and how we got here. And then we want to dive quite deep into the different pillars, materiality thresholds, what changed from the proposed ruling, and then what companies can do to get started in the preparation of disclosures, starting right now. So to start, I would like it to hand it over to Harman. So Harman, tell us really where we are today and how we got there in terms of the SEC's rules.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. I'd like to start by setting some context on what's been driving this global push for climate-related regulations. So over the past couple of decades, we've seen this increased focus from investor community on climate risks and the impact it has on companies and sectors. Now, as billion-dollar disasters become more common in the US and around the world, climate risks are having an increased impact on those companies across their value chain. So from their supply chain, from their owned operations, facilities, and downstream processes and consumers. And you see some of these eye-watering numbers, 90 billion in 2023 alone from weather-related disasters. Now, that's led to increased demands and pressures on regulators to create a common methodology and reporting requirements for understanding these climate risks and the impact they have on companies, so that investors can make informed decisions about the resilience of a given company and a sector against climate risks today and especially in the future. Now, it's important to consider this lens as we try to understand the SEC's ruling and requirements. Next slide, please. So to refresh everyone's memory on timelines, the SEC has been working on this final rule for a number of years, but really the process has started well before the March 6th ruling. It begins with investor pressure to mandate a more consistent, more comparable climate disclosures to support their investment decisions. You've commonly heard of the term alphabet soup, is really trying to make sense of that. Now in 2022, the SEC announces the proposed rule, which is over 500 pages. And then from there, there's a lengthy feedback period where the SEC receives thousands of comments and is really, it's gone through a robust process to really incorporate those comments and feedbacks. And after 2 years, we see the finalized rule, providing filers with over 800 pages of documentation that applies to all publicly listed companies in the United States to disclose on climate-related disclosures. It's worth emphasizing again what Chris mentioned, that the rule is still being challenged in the US Circuit Appeal Courts. Now, this final rule is being interpreted by many as a new regulatory floor on climate disclosures, meaning that companies can anticipate this as the minimum disclosure requirements and anticipate more change and evolution in the future. Next slide.
Thanks, Harman.
I'd like to take a minute. Sorry, Chris. Oh, I'll pass it over. Thanks.
Thanks, Harman. I'll do a little bit of an overview of what Harman just covered, but really digging into kind of some of the notable takeaways from the March 6th rule as it currently stands is really a focus on kind of 7 key components that this webinar will dive into. The first being, of course, the disclosure of material climate-related risks, activities that are being undertaken to mitigate or adapt to those risks, disclosure of material scope 1 and or 2 emissions, and then information on any board of directors or management role on climate related risks itself. And then of course, information on any climate related targets or goals that a company has disclosed publicly, and then attestation requirements, and then disclosure on financial impacts, as Harman just said, of severe weather related events. Those are kind of the 7 main takeaways that we'll really be focusing on both in this webinar and just diving deeper into. Before we do that, on the next slide, we'll take a step back and just talk about who needs to disclose. And so first, the final rule does apply to any company that's registered with the SEC, and the registrant type will determine the type and timing of the requirements itself for disclosure. On the next slide, of course, we do have the timeline as it currently stands. As Chris and Harman have both said, of course, this is subject to change given the final results of the court ruling, but as it currently stands, large accelerated filers are going to be impacted first with a 2026 requirement of filing their impacts around material expenditures and material scope 1 and scope 2 emissions in 2026, followed by any limited assurance that must be obtained in the 2029 calendar year. Of course, if you're not a large accelerated filer and you fall into either an accelerated filer, non-accelerated filer, SRCs, and EGCs, you have a bit more time to meet these requirements. But again, this is all with a grain of salt, since we'll have to see what happens from the court ruling itself. And in terms of the where to disclose, disclosures will be made either in the registration statement and the annual reports of companies. Again, this might change just given what happens with the court ruling, but making the when and the where kind of clear before we do our deeper dive. Also for the reporting period itself, as it currently stands, companies that are filing a registration statement with information on the most recent year have at least 225 days before the date of effectiveness to report on, essentially giving you a little bit of, just a buffer in terms of the reporting period itself versus when you're doing the disclosure. On the next slide, we'll dive a little bit deeper into just there are 7 pillars through our detailed deep dive, really just focusing on what we'll be covering, which is the removal of I'm sorry, on the next slide, Elizabeth, thank you. The kind of core notable changes that we did want to discuss before we do that deep dive from the original March 2022 rule to the final rule that came out March 6th is the removal of any Scope 3 reporting requirement, the addition of a materiality clause as it relates to Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, the removal of value chains from climate-related risk, and less granularity for physical risk disclosure. There's also a shift away from climate-related opportunities. And as it relates to time horizons, the medium time horizon is no longer a requirement when disclosing on climate-related risks. There's also an addition of an impact from climate transition risk that was removed from the expenditure effect. And there's also an addition of materiality determination for any risk management and management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks. And there was also required to disclose on activities to mitigate or adapt to material climate risk and a requirement to disclose on material targets and goals, including those not publicly announced. So those are some of the key notable changes from March 2022 to March 2024 as it relates to climate-related disclosure pillars. And for the financial statements, the financial statement impact metrics were removed. It's also no longer required to disclose on climate-related impacts on their finance. And the scope for expenses has also been a bit narrower than it was in the original rule as it was written. These are some of the high-level changes that we've just noticed that we wanted to call out for anyone that, maybe read the original rule and hasn't had time to catch up on the final rule. Now I'll pass it over to Harmon, who will do a deeper dive on some of those pillars that we were just talking about.
Thanks, Sundara. And over the next few slides, we'll provide a brief, not exhaustive view of the core pillars that Sundara was touching on, starting with the first one, identified material climate risk. So as the name suggests, the disclosure requirement focuses on identifying the material climate risks that are reasonably likely to have an impact on a business and its strategy. And now, one notable change here is, the new rules only asking for short next 12 months or long term beyond the next 12 month time horizon. So notably, they've taken out the medium term, which is consistent with other SEC reporting requirements on time horizons. One key thing to call out here, and it's going to be a consistent theme as we go through this, is that materiality threshold. Now, the new rule emphasizes that only material climate risks are required to be disclosed. And this is based on the existing SEC definition of what is considered material, something that's going to have substantial likelihood to influence a reasonable investor's decision to whether or not to invest in a company or a security, and as well as emitting that information will have an influence. So on the next slide, this next pillar, it outlines the disclosure requirements for reporting on the impacts of climate risk on a company's strategy and business model. So the SEC does require the reporting of actual, which is present, and potential, which is future climate risk, which is a slight departure from the TCFD guidelines that some of you might be familiar with. It requires issuers to report on climate risks on their climate risks of their business strategy, as well as their business model, as well as mitigation and adaptation actions specific to those material climate risks. Now, some things that have been pared back a little bit is climate scenario analysis is only deemed necessary to report on if there's material climate risks. And similarly, if a company has adopted a climate transition plan to manage transition risks, then they're required to report on that. And then lastly, if a company has adopted an internal carbon price to manage climate risks, they're required to report on that as well. And again, you see this theme of the materiality threshold applied to whether the issuers are required to report on climate risks. So in the first two pillars, we assess the climate risks. In the next two pillars, we'll talk about how to manage those climate risks. So next slide, please. So this next slide looks at the governance pillar, which is akin to the first pillar from the TCFD guidelines. Now, this pillar is really central to ownership and accountability within an organization of climate risks. It focuses on two core elements, board oversight and the management's role. Specific to board oversight, are there committees or subcommittees that oversee climate risks? Does the board have oversight of tracking the progress towards targets and goals if a company has set those, including transition plans? Now, notable omission in the new rule is that relevant climate expertise is not required for the board. And the second core element here is the management's role in assessing and managing climate risks, whether there's responsibilities and key here relevant expertise within management, the processes to assess and manage those climate risks, and reporting of those climate risks, and whether there's a reporting process for to the board and its subcommittees. And again, this is all deemed important whether there's, if climate risks are material to an organization or an issuer. It's worth noting a non-disclosure here can be perceived by investors that the company has not made the effort to kind of set up these processes for managing climate risks. Now, on the next slide, we'll look at risk management, which is the systems and processes for managing climate risk within an organization. So it begins with the processes that an organization is set up to identify, assess, and manage climate risks, aligned with a risk management framework, as well as how an organization has integrated or taken steps to integrate those risk management processes with overall risk management systems, such as ERM, compliance, the like. So those first four pillars really give us a sense of what how to assess climate risks and how to manage and govern them. Before we go into the next few pillars, I'd like to pause to take a poll to engage our audience a little bit with this poll question. So how well do you understand potentially material climate risks within your organization? Have you not started? Have you started identifying material climate risks? Are you at the stage of performing scenario analysis to assess those risks? And have you assessed adaptation and mitigation measures to manage those risks? So we'll give a brief moment for everyone to complete that poll, and then we'll pass it over to Sundara to walk us through the next few pillars.
Great. As the results are coming in, it looks like most of the companies we're seeing have started to identify those climate risks. So it's great to see that folks are having an active role in this process already and are closer to being ready for that kind of disclosure requirement as it currently stands. Elizabeth, we'll move to the next slide. Now we'll talk a little bit more about target and goal related disclosure. And so under item 1504, companies are required to disclose climate related targets or goals that materially affect or can reasonably likely have a material impact on our business. And for the disclosure of these targets and goals, it's important to notice that the SEC does not require a public announcement or a formal adoption by the board or the CEO for these targets or goals to be required as part of the disclosure. Additionally, the final rule also requires a disclosure of any carbon offsets or RECs that are used and that are a material part of a company's plan to meet its climate-related target or goal. This is an important distinction, again, because there are a number of companies that have purchased RECs and carbon offsets, and so this is a disclosure requirement that is dependent on how important those purchases are as it relates to meeting your target and goal. It's also, again, important that recognize that under materiality threshold, the final rule did not imposed requirement to disclose any interim targets. So for companies that do have interim targets, you're not required to include those as part of this disclosure process. Under the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the greenhouse gas emissions disclosure requirements. Again, here for large accelerator filers who will have to kind of disclose this first, and for any company that's looking to disclose this, the materiality threshold is around your scope 1 and or 2 emissions. So essentially determining if a reasonable investor would need to have insight into your emissions footprint to make a decision, then that's kind of the minimum requirement for being able to disclose that. Additionally, kind of the materiality of certain constituent gases on the company's business is also kind of another threshold that they've put. And for companies that do disclose their scope 1 and or 2 emissions, you're also required to describe the methodology, inputs, and assumptions that were used to make that calculation. And so again, this is kind of expanding the full kind of state of what it is that you need to disclose. It's no longer just the numbers, but it's also kind of the methodology that went into that calculation process itself, just making it a bit more clear and giving investors deeper insight into that process and how it was conducted. This also ties in nicely to the next slide, which is related to the attestation requirements of the GHG emissions disclosure itself, where registrants are required to use an independent, qualified third party for GHG emissions attestation that have expertise. While the final rule requires disclosure of any oversight of the attestation process itself, here again, it's to allow investors to understand who is doing the inspection. Was there, any kind of oversight into the assurance process itself to give investors, reliability and integrity for the data that's disclosed. Attestation requirements are also going to apply prospectively, which means that they'll be phased in. And for historical periods where attestation is not required, it will be required in the future. So you'll just be retroactively doing that process for any historical reporting, which is also important to note. And then I think for the next slide, we'll go into expenditure metrics. So here, kind of moving away from, apologies, I forgot we have a poll for this too. For any companies that are kind of at this process and the stage thinking about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, the question for the group is, have you started measuring your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions? Are you thinking about it? Have you partially measured it? Or would you feel comfortable doing a public disclosure as it stands today of your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions? Great. This feels a little bit more mixed, with half the group, it seems, feeling comfortable and confident that they have measured their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and others that are a little bit more in the partial space or have at least had internal conversations and are hoping to do it in the future, it sounds like. As we close out the section on emissions, we'll talk about the last two main pillars that we'll be focusing on, which is first, expenditure metrics. And here what we'll be talking about is really this disclosure around severe weather events and other natural conditions that have resulted in expenditures expensed as incurred in losses and capitalized costs and charges that will need to be reported publicly. There's also capitalized costs, expenditures expensed, and losses related to the purchase and use of carbon offsets and RECs and financial statements. And again, the materiality threshold here is that if the impact exceeds 1% of absolute capitalized costs, expenditures expensed, and losses, then you are required to report on these weather-related events and natural conditions which have caused any impacts in the reporting period. And similar to the previous materiality threshold, if RECs and carbon offset disclosures are an important part of any climate-related targets or goals, you're also required to disclose on the expenses incurred as part of these purchases. And the last pillar that we'll be going through is around financial estimates and assumptions. And here what we're really referring to is if estimates or assumptions are used to produce the financial statements, then there must be a qualitative description of the process itself that's included in the disclosure. And again, similarly, the materiality threshold is that if the disclosure of expenditures expensed, losses, capitalized costs, and charges equal or exceed 1% of the absolute value of certain financial metrics, then they must be disclosed. And so again, very similar to the previous materiality threshold that was discussed. So this is the last pillar in this section. So happy to pass it back to Herman to talk about some kind of key next steps.
Thanks, Sundara. So in this next section, we'll take a few moments to unpack how our audience can think about preparing. So first, we'll talk about, next slide, please, how to assess material climate risk. So central theme in today's discussion and the ruling for SEC was materiality. So it begs the question, how do you assess materiality of climate risks? So it's worth defining up front what we mean by climate risks. So there's two big categories here. The first is physical risks. So the impact of direct climate-driven weather events on your business. And this breaks down into two subcategories of acute risks, such as tropical storms, wildfires, so extreme weather events, and chronic risks, things that happen over time, such as sea level rise. And these impacts are typically felt on an organization's or a company's operations, supply chain, materials, infrastructure. Now, on the other hand, we have transition risks. So this is as the world begins to decarbonize, we put in policies to reduce GHG emissions. What are the risks associated with that to your company and your value chain? And this can be thought of in terms of policy and legal risks, market-driven risks, technology risks, as well as reputational impacts. So from there, we advise on taking a four-step approach, starting with the mapping of all risks that impact an organization. So we identify everything that an organization is potentially exposed to across their value chain under different time horizons. And then from there, we begin to prioritize what climate risks can be potentially material from a financial impact in conversations with cross-functional stakeholders. And then from there, we narrow it down further to assess the future exposure and vulnerability to those risks through scenario analysis, and that might be a term that some of you are familiar with. And then lastly, we start to quantify the actual business impacts and financial risks through a detailed assessment, through detailed scenario analysis, and really bringing in mitigation measures as well as kind of key business inputs. So through that entire funnel of narrowing down, we're able to identify which risks are potentially material, as well as really highlight their impact on a company's strategy and business model. And this sets the foundation for registrants and issuers to really get a sense of whether something is worth disclosing, whether it's material. So now I'll pass it over to Sundara, who's going to walk us through GHG emissions.
I think it's important to kind of state this at the get-go, but as the expression goes, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think this is particularly relevant when thinking about materiality for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. For a lot of companies, it's great if you've already started this process, but really understanding your emissions baseline is just the critical first step of understanding what is your impact on the planet and what is your ability to have change. And so part of these questions is just tied into by having a footprint, you're allowed to understand what is your impact in comparison to others. Are you kind of in line with expectations for your sector? And are there any potential hotspots for companies to focus on? And of course, once you do have an emissions baseline, it becomes that much easier to consider a future climate related target or goal if that's of interest to the company. And so really taking that first step is doing an emissions baselining. And so a lot of companies that we're seeing in the space have really started that Scope 1 and Scope 2 accounting process since it's much more direct and straightforward. than scope 3 accounting. And so really, we've worked with a lot of clients and companies that are getting started on this process. And by understanding that initial emissions baseline, you can also understand potential exposure risks around transition risks as well, and understand the potential impact of future regulations in the space. If there's any kind of carbon tax or things like that in place, it also allows you to understand future transition risks for the company. And that's why scope 1 and scope 2 emissions accounting is just an integral first step for companies that are getting involved into the space. And of course, that materiality threshold for the SEC comes back to that idea of, would a reasonable investor consider the disclosure of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions important when making an investment or voting decision? And part of that is a bit of an unknown until you actually measure your emissions baseline. And so really, it's an important first step for any company that wants to understand if this is material, if there's opportunities for improvement, and what their next steps could look like. Now I'll pass it over to Chris for some high-level takeaways.
Thank you, Sundara. Well, hopefully everyone has a bit better understanding than when they first joined this webinar around how we got here with the SEC rules and the disclosure pillars themselves. I want to leave you just with a few final thoughts on the next slide around what are the trends that we're seeing and how can you begin to prepare. So climate-related disclosures are becoming increasingly mandatory. Now, we've seen this with California, rumblings in other states, now the SEC, we see CSRD in Europe. Now, they are going through litigation and challenges, and I imagine they will continue to, but the trend is remaining the same, that we are seeing this in an increasing way. Starting early is going to help. The earlier you start, the more confidence you will have in that information that you are being required and asked to put out publicly. And in a similar vein, engaging internal stakeholders early and often is going to lead to success. A lot of this data that organizations need to collect in order to do the work around greenhouse gas emissions or climate risk, it might be the first time that those organizations are collecting that data, at least to that level of granularity or to that level of scrutiny or traceability. And so engaging the stakeholders and the data owners early in the process and getting them bought in is going to lead to much more repeatable results and also results that you feel more confident in. And to that end, establishing a clear approach is very important. This is not something you will do once and put aside and never do again. Most likely this will be an annual process. And so both from an auditability perspective, but also a repeatability perspective, you want to make sure that all of your data sources, your collection methods, and the assumptions you're making, you want to have this all documented incredibly clearly and in one place. There's different words for those types of documents, and there's different ways to do that, but the idea remains the same, that you want to clearly document all of this process so that someone else could pick it up and understand exactly what was done at your organization to repeat the process or to audit the process. And finally, I want to end with a piece of empathy. I know at a lot of large organizations, small sustainability teams are asked to do increasingly large tasks. And so there's partners like South Pole, but also partners in your network, your peers at other firms, your peers within your organization that are here to help. So if you have any questions, please ask them now, but also feel free to reach out and ask us any questions. Always happy to take a call and just chat through any of these specifics if you wanted to. And with that, we'll flip over to the question slide. There is a QR code on the next slide if you want to learn about other webinars that are upcoming. We cover a variety of different topics. We've talked about California's climate laws. We have one coming up on biodiversity and the Task Force for Nature Disclosures. So if you want to learn about that, feel free to pull out your phone and take a look there. In the meantime, there is a couple questions in the chat, which I want to address first and foremost. But if you have any questions now that you've heard everything, feel free to enter them and we have some time to discuss. So I'll start with the easiest one and also the first one that was entered. Are you going to share the slides? So we will share the recording, which will include all of the slides, but we won't be sharing a PDF of the slides after, but we will share a recording to all the registrants. So if you have others in your organization you'd like to share that with, you're more than welcome. Another question here, and this one is for Harmon. So um, someone asked, what would you say is the biggest difference between the SEC's disclosure rules versus the TCFD guidance? And then they go on to talk about what are the differences, and there's been a lot of time that the SEC has been looking back and forth around. So Harmon, can you elaborate a little bit more on what's really the difference between TCFD and the SEC's requirements?
Yeah, great question. And it's one that's been on the mind of a lot of folks. I think first thing to acknowledge up front is the SEC is informed by the TCFD. So that's great news. So there's been a concerted effort to build off best practices and commonly accepted frameworks such as the TCFD, the Task Force for Financial Climate Disclosures, as well as the GHG protocol. So that's good news. So if if you're well on track and understanding the TCFD, you'll start to see some of the similarities there. I'll actually start with some of the similarities. So the backbone of the SEC rules is the four pillars of the TCFD framework. The governance, which you would recognize from our slides or presentation, risk management, strategy, which is the impact of climate risks, and then metrics and targets around GHG targets, goal setting. So there's a lot of, fundamental similarities there. Now, where there's differences is, in part, we see from the proposed rule to the new rule, there's been some changes. And one way to interpret it is the proposed rule was more aligned to the TCFD. The new rule has been refined based on feedback from on comments, as well as it's a little bit more akin to some of the SEC language and frameworks that we're used to seeing. But to call some of these out, the SEC opportunities in the SEC requirements, climate-related opportunities are more voluntary. The focus is really on risks. And one that everyone's picked up on today, and it's probably the key takeaway: the materiality concept and threshold. That you're required to only disclose once a risk is deemed material. And then as part of that, scenario analysis has become optional, taking away the medium time horizon. Where the SEC goes a little bit beyond is it's actually asks for actual climate risks as well as future. So that's one area where the SEC is actually asking a little bit more of filers and registrants. And lastly, it's worth noting, if you're familiar with the TCFD or TCFD framework, the guidelines, or your sustainability team is already working towards that, I think you're well on track. And it's about just building in some of that guidance to refine your processes, your systems, to make sure they align. So starting with a gap assessment. And for the trickier bits, such as materiality, climate risk assessment, transition plans, targets and goals, I think where you don't have those in-house capabilities, I think it's a good idea to kind of get an expert opinion to see, where are the difference and if they actually apply to you as a filer. Thanks.
Thanks, Harmon. We have another question around greenhouse gas accounting. I think as the poll showed, a lot of companies have done their scope 1 and 2. Not all of them have gone through an audit process. Maybe not all of them have documented their processes in something like an inventory management plan. So Sundar, can you talk us through, just at a high level, how are you helping clients prepare for audits on their greenhouse gas emissions, and what are sort of the main pieces that you see being included in inventory management plans?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think an inventory management plan, first and foremost, is just really a crucial live document that really understands and outlines the current data management plan for any company that's doing annual accounting. And also is a great starting place to understand what is the current process, how is data flowing through the organization, what quality assurance process exists, and if it doesn't exist, what can exist in the future to really build out a robust methodology, a clear understanding of where inputs are coming from, how information is being validated, and what are any if assumptions that are being used to make extrapolations and proxies. As we understand, most annual footprints as they currently stand are not based on 100% primary data that's 100% vetted. And so really this is the first, kind of document to set up that process to help make future limited assurance that much easier to get by having a clear kind of breakout of how is information currently captured, who's involved in that process, how is that information being verified, and what is the emission factors and methodology that's going into the final calculation, and then what are the opportunities for improvement, both in terms of data granularity, but also ensuring that there's a quality assurance process in place so that when a third party comes in to do a limited assurance, they have a full understanding of how it is that your organization is doing the calculations that they can review in a clear place. And so I think that inventory management plan is just a critical document for any organization to have, especially as we move to a world where it is really annual GHG accounting. So having a document to go back to every year to know what the process is and know what the timelines are is just really fundamental. And auditors love it, so that's also helpful.
That is very helpful. Thank you very much, Sundara. Question for Harman and Sundara. There's a few things around, or a few questions around next steps. So Harman, I'll go to you first. The poll showed that most of the attendees have started looking at which climate risks are material, but maybe hadn't moved to that scenario analysis. Now I know the medium timeline was removed from the SEC. So talk to me about those companies that are at that stage. What are some concrete next steps they can consider to get ready for these disclosures?
Yeah. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, if you're far along on the process, let's say aligned to the TCFD or the original SEC ruling, what steps do you need to take? What steps should you be taking at this moment?
I would refine it a little bit, Harman. I would say, based on the poll, it looked like some had begun to assess
Mhm.
what climate risks are material. They hadn't fully completed it, and they hadn't really gone beyond that.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think a good starting point, and I mean, we touched on this a little bit on how to prepare. I think it's worth emphasizing again here that, that's really the line that is required by the new rule on whether you need to disclose the materiality threshold. Now, it's not as easy as saying, it's not material because the SEC is going to look into a lot of these filings. There's your peers, there's the sector benchmarks. So if a lot of your peers are reporting on these material risks and you're not, then investors are going to want more clarity. So in terms of how you go about, if you've only identified those material climate risks, what do you go do from there? I think that's a great start. I think there's a few elements to consider. One is, the TCFD aligned approach to assessing climate risks. So ensure that you have the physical, the transition. You're looking at least, short and long time horizon. You're looking at a couple of scenarios. And then you're also assessing, your across your value chain, those risks. And one element that, we see with a lot of our clients going through this journey that's often, not considered, or at least not to a later stage, is it's very integral to have internal stakeholder engagement along that journey. So when you are identifying the risks, ensure that you're not doing it in a silo, that you are getting cross-functional, input. And as you go through that process of filtering and assessing and starting to quantify the business exposure of those risks, and then ultimately the financial risk, you're getting buy-in validation because ultimately, it's not just the sustainability team that's going to need to report on this. We're talking about the SEC. It's going to be a compliance function or reporting function. It's going to be a collaborative exercise. So it's integral to build that along the journey. And as mentioned, some of these bits are quite tricky. What is a climate scenario? What is a time horizon? So to the extent you have the capacity, I think it's great. But we also advise getting expert guidance on those bits to ensure that you're following the right process. Sundar, I'll leave it to you to add a bit there.
Yeah, I guess, we've kind of talked about what the immediate next steps are, but I would say for any company that is either starting to do their accounting for the first time or looking to make their accounting more robust as it relates to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions accounting is really having a clear understanding of the data collection process for your company, as it depends for every single company where that information is coming from is typically across a variety of different stakeholders in your organization. And so understanding who has the data currently, how to access it, and how to create a system to make annual accounting more straightforward, since data collection typically tends to be the largest time and labor sink when we think about accounting annually. So really setting up a robust data collection process, making sure the right stakeholders are involved, and making sure they have a clear understanding of timelines and expectations as well, since we understand doing GHG accounting is not typically someone's day job. It's kind of spread out amongst your stakeholders. And so just making that system easier and more straightforward typically will make that process easier.
Thank you very much, Sundara. And thank you, Sundara and Harmon, for your time and your expertise today. I really appreciate it. If anyone on the call has any other questions that they'd like to reach out to Sundara or Harmon about, or myself, always happy to take a call. Elizabeth, if you go to the next slide, I think there's contact details. Yeah, so emails are there if you want to take a quick screenshot or a picture. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy just to have a call, talk to you about where you're at and any specific questions you might have. And otherwise, we hope you have a lovely rest of your week and hope to talk to you soon. So thanks again. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.